Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Lauren Reese, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Wilson Center and our partners at the Pulitzer Center, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's expert panel on biodiversity, community resilience, and global stability. For those of you joining the Wilson Center for the first time, I'll say just a quick word about us. The Wilson Center is a think tank mandated by the U.S. Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. We're home to about 15 programs that focus on every corner of the globe and today's most pressing issues. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, works to connect insights at the intersection of environment, population, health, and security to foreign policy and international development. Next month, global leaders, researchers, and civil society will convene in Cali, Colombia for the 16th UN Biodiversity Summit, or COP16. 2 years ago, COP15 saw the adoption of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which set ambitious targets to conserve 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030 and increase financing for biodiversity conservation. This year's COP will focus on developing a concrete plan to implement those goals laid out in 2022. It's difficult to put into words the urgency of protecting the world's biodiversity and to convey just how interconnected biodiversity is with so much of what we take for granted. I've heard it said that all life breathes together. What we do to our planet, we do to ourselves. But because of the intricate complexity in which natural systems operate, it can be difficult to succinctly convey just what is at stake when we don't protect ecosystems. One example that came across my desk this week is a new paper published in Science that attributes 1,300 infant deaths to the collapse of North America's bat population. When a deadly bat disease wiped out millions of bats in the US, farmers increased the use of pesticides, which led to an 8% increase in infant mortality in those areas. Crimes against nature, wildlife trafficking, illegal deforestation, IUU fishing, embolden and strengthen organized crime, networks that transcend political borders and have a destabilizing effect on communities and governments around the world. As global population continues to grow and climate impacts are more acutely felt, protecting the ecosystems, which are foundational to life on our planet, is necessary. And reaching the goals laid out in the Global Biodiversity Framework requires a true paradigm shift. It cannot be achieved through a patchwork of policies and investments. So our goal with this event is to underscore the relevance of COP16 to foreign policy, international development, and international security in ways that help to inform that paradigm shift. To discuss these connections and shed light on how we can advance biodiversity conservation, we've brought together a fantastic panel of experts. João Campos Silva is a National Geographic explorer investigating changes in habitat and migratory conditions for aquatic wildlife throughout the Amazon River Basin. As a conservationist and researcher, he focuses on aligning biodiversity conservation and human well-being. He's been working in Amazonia since 2008 and is the inaugural president of Instituto João. You're going to have to correct that for me, João. A research nonprofit focused on supporting community-based solutions for Amazonian conservation. Dr. Campos Silva is also a 2019 Rolex Award laureate. Anton Delgado is a freelance multimedia journalist in Southeast Asia who covers climate, politics, business, and the environment. He's an investigative fellow for the Rainforest Investigations Network at the Pulitzer Center, focusing on forest and wildlife crimes in Cambodia and across Southeast Asia, particularly related to timber trade, forest management, and the privatization of protected area. There's a link to his reporting in his bio on the event page you're viewing this on, and I encourage you to read his stories. Dr. Rod Schoonover is co-founder of the Eco Security Council and adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches climate science. Rod served a decade in the U.S. intelligence community as the Director of Environment and Natural Resources at the National Intelligence Council in the Office of the Director of the National Intelligence, and as Senior Scientist and Senior Analyst in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He also previously served as a tenured professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and has a PhD in theoretical chemical physics from the University of Michigan. Jennifer Tauli Corpus is from the Kankanaey Igorot people of Mountain Province in the Philippines and is the managing director of policy at Niatero, a U.S.-based foundation that supports indigenous guardianship of collective territory and culture worldwide. Jennifer is a longtime leader in the Indigenous rights and biodiversity space, representing Indigenous peoples as a negotiator and expert for the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. She was part of the negotiations that led to the adoption of two key pieces of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Nagoya Protocol and the Global Biodiversity Framework. To those tuning in, please have your questions ready. You'll see a box under the video where you're viewing this as a place to input your questions, and we will try to save as much time as possible for those Q&A and engagement with the panel. We are going to first hear from Anton. Anton, drawing from your stories from Southeast Asia, including in Cambodia and Vietnam, could you share some of the current biodiversity challenges that you're seeing in the region and their impacts? Maybe sort of the impacts close to home, as well as the ripple effects that they're having across the region. Over to you.
Absolutely, Lauren. Thanks for the introduction. So great to be here with the Wilson Center, representing the Pulitzer Center. Yeah, to start, I just want to clarify and make clear that, a lot of my reporting and coverage of biodiversity is largely centered on wildlife, because as a freelance journalist, our stories that relate to wildlife are usually more sellable than newsrooms and editors around the world, because people usually relate and have an easier time empathizing with wildlife stories. So as you can see from a couple of the pictures the Wilson Center is showing now, these are all from coverage that we've done throughout the Mekong and Southeast Asia. To get to the questions of challenges, there sure are a ton in Southeast Asia, which I know Jen can talk about as well. But I would boil it down to two main competing threats that I would see as the largest threats to biodiversity in our region because of their ability to create large-scale landscape-altering change. So first, for Southeast Asia, without a doubt, it would be the development boom. Our region is made up of 11 countries, 7 of which are considered less economically developed. So naturally, this means many of our governments, including the Cambodian government, which is currently where I'm living, and my government back home in the Philippines, are prioritizing economic growth through infrastructure, trade, entrepreneurship, over environmental protection a lot of the time. And I think a really good example of this that I know Zhao would be able to relate to is hydropower development on the Mekong River and its tributaries. Of the 6 countries that share the Mekong River, which flows, from China all the way to the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, 5 have built operating hydropower dams on the basin. And that's impacting a whole range of species as well as the aquatic ecosystem. A lot of the species you can see on the bottom right-hand side of this graphic. You have the Mekong giant catfish, the Irrawaddy dolphin, and the Mekong giant barb. So some of these flagship species that really represent what's happening to the migratory paths in the Mekong. This challenge to Southeast Asia is a little complicated because these countries do have a right to develop. As a Filipino and also as a resident of Cambodia for the past 3 years, development does help a lot of the citizenry in our region. So I think trying to find a way to balance the need for development and uplifting of poverty to environmental protections in a time of climate change is something that we can discuss more in this chat, and it's something being figured out in all of the COPs. I'd say the second main challenge, just to wrap up briefly, is of course climate risk. I'm a firm believer that natural phenomenons become natural disasters when they collide with poverty and a lack of planning, which unfortunately are both really common in Southeast Asia. I'm a little obsessed with climate risk. It's something that I really want to do better reporting on, and unfortunately, a lot of newsrooms don't find the topic very sexy. So it's quite hard to sell those stories, especially when it's risk and things that could happen. A lot of news likes to focus on what is happening now. And naturally, the World Meteorological Organization and the World Bank all classify Southeast Asia as one of the most climate risk regions in the world. And if you look at the sites, we're susceptible to almost everything, from rising sea levels to heat waves, floods, droughts, and the list keeps going. And I would say that has a huge potential to create landscape altering change. I would say in a sad level of good news, the one risk that we're not at risk of is freeze risk. So I'd say at least that's a small positive for Southeast Asia. Thank goodness we won't have to deal with Western winters. But I do think that those two are the main issues that we're going to have to face as a region going forward. So the development boom and risks caused by climate change. Back to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Anton. We'll come back to you in a minute because we have a lot of follow-up questions. But I want to move to Joao. Anton mentioned your work with communities, and your work really is at that intersection of communities and biodiversity and strengthening community-based efforts to save Amazonian species in ways that also, contribute to the resilience of those communities. So can you talk to us about the links between protecting biodiversity and supporting local livelihoods and food supplies and culture? And how conservation can provide a better avenue for better life in those communities.
Hi, thank you very much. Good morning for all. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I think that we can provide different links between this discussion around the world. Basically, we have been trying to understand how can we align biodiversity protection and people well-being in Brazilian Amazonia. Claire, please pass the slides. When we think in Amazonia, we started to think about biodiversity. And this is like the hegemonic paradigm in terms of conservation. For a long time, people were excluded from the conservation perspectives. And for many, many years, Amazonia was considered like a pristine environment, like a empty environment. But in fact, when we go deeper in the Amazon, we can see, please, you can pass the slide. We can see that the Amazonia is full of people. There are different indigenous groups coexisting with the biodiversity since a long time. Many of those groups, you can pass, please, still live in a deep relationship with nature, and in most cases in a healthy relationship. But actually, beyond the coexistence, those people are also developing, you can pass, please, social technologies that are very, very important to understand how to handle with the biodiversity protection in a very complex environment in terms of economic needs, cultural diversity, different ways to see the world. You can pass, please. And then we have a good example, which is related to the pirarucu, as we call in Brazil, the arapaima, which is the largest freshwater scaled fish on Earth. This fish was almost extinct due to its very high economic and cultural importance. But then it was rescued by local communities through the territorial protection. You can pass. Basically, the local communities protect the environment against illegal fishers, illegal loggers, and then the arapaima is protected and can reproduce and replenish and colonize other environments. One single community can protect up to 170,000 hectares. So basically, at this moment that we are talking here, we have more than 5,000 people protecting around 15 million hectares in Amazonia against deforestation and overexploitation of natural resources. You can pass, please. The impact of the territorial protection is really, really strong. Basically, in protected lakes, we have more than 500 individuals compared to only 9 in open access or unprotected environment. You can pass. And many other, so this protection resulted in a recovery of wild population higher than 600% in 15 years. And we should highlight that most places around the world are experiencing a collapse, population reduction of megafauna. So it's a very, very opposite direction that we can see in Amazonia when you have like a leadership and ownership of local communities in conservation projects. You can pass, please. And the protection also protect many other species that are not targeted in the model, including aquatic mammals, freshwater turtles, large catfishes, migratory birds, caimans, and even invertebrates. So basically, when you protect the territory, all the forests start to recover again. You can pass, please. basically the places where we have the community protecting are like biodiversity island, full of biodiversity, full of life, compared to unprotected places that are very, very depleted. You can pass. So basically we have a model when you have like empowered communities leading the example that ensure the biodiversity protection, but also ensure income generation, infrastructure improvements, gender equity, social security and food security, territorial autonomy. All those benefits can result in an increasing self-esteem and sense of pride, which is very important to keep people living in rural areas, but with good conditions in terms of quality of life. You can pass. And so for this reason, we used to say that the RPM is the fish of change, because it's a model that can inspire us a new perspective in terms of conservation and local development, leaving behind the more colonial perspective and bringing the sense of empowerment of local communities as the cornerstone of conservation, especially in tropical developing countries. You can pass, and you have many different challenges, including large hydroelectric projects, overexploitation. But I would like to spotlight one recent and very concerning threat, which is the increasing of narco traffic in Brazilian Amazonia. So basically, those remote places without strong governance are being occupied by narco traffickants. And this is the kind of war that is not possible to handle with local communities and local leaders. We need a more integrative effort between governments and international cooperation to handle those problems, which is a huge threat for conservation and for the security of local people. You can please pass. Thank you very much. I think we can move forward in the discussion with the questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joel. That's a really important point about the importance of sort of community-based efforts, but the fact that it's not, the burden cannot be solely on the community, right? There are larger dynamics at play that require strong government responses. Jennifer, that's a nice lead-in to you and your work. Could you take us a little bit more into that connection between Indigenous stewardship and rights and biodiversity protection, and where you see real opportunities, but also maybe where it needs to be in partnership with some of these broader governance initiatives?
Yeah, thank you. And unfortunately, my slides didn't make it in time, but I do have a presentation prepared. And, you know, I'm part of this global movement of Indigenous peoples engaging in biodiversity issues. And I've been doing this for 17 years now. And there are a lot of Indigenous peoples that are interested in engaging in the different biodiversity forums, biodiversity spaces. And they fall into two categories. The first are those who firmly believe that they can offer solutions. And then the others are looking for places where they could where they could find support to address threats to their communities. When we started our engagement, very early on in the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, there was a recognition of the connection between culture and nature. And one of the earliest indicators that they identified of ecosystem health is the number of speakers of Indigenous languages. So that is a proxy indicator. So if there are more people, speaking different languages, more people speaking Indigenous languages, then that usually correlates with healthy ecosystems. And as we went along, by the time we got to COP14 in Egypt, there were celebrations now of the link between nature and culture. And so when we came to the point where we had to develop a new strategic plan for how to enhance biodiversity conservation, there were many studies that had started coming out showing that indigenous peoples' territories, although there was a worldwide phenomenon of extinction, and species were declining everywhere. But the global assessment conducted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, for some reason, found that in indigenous peoples' territories, although biodiversity is declining, it's declining at a much slower rate compared to non-indigenous territories. And the question was why? Of course, we had that was the question that was raised. And during the course of those negotiations on the new strategic plan, we tried to articulate what exactly it is about indigenous worldviews, indigenous values that make them good stewards of nature. And we identified a few. Number one is the value that we put on ecosystems and biodiversity. So it's not just the economic value, although as Joao has pointed out, it's very important, but there are spiritual values, there are cultural values, and all of these values need to be taken into account. When looking at biodiversity, it can't be regarded as free anymore. We have to look at the different types of values that people who live very close with nature put on biodiversity. And then, of course, we also had a number of studies coming out showing that in places where tenure security exists, indigenous peoples are better able to protect their territories. And so we see that about 1/3 of global land is under stewardship of indigenous peoples, but only about a small percentage. And let me refer to my slides now so that I make sure that I'm not making a mistake. So this was the study that I was talking about, where the IPBES found that nature is declining at a much slower rate in indigenous peoples' territories. And then again, scientific studies coming out showing, and this is based on mother tongue, right? And showing that about 1/3 of global land is stewarded by indigenous peoples. And if you look very closely, if you zoom in, you'll see that a lot of these lands are intersecting with the biodiverse areas. And the interesting thing is that of all these lands of indigenous peoples where biodiversity is declining less rapidly, only 40% is covered by protected or conserved areas, which means that even if there is no legal framework protecting the area, indigenous peoples, through their management governance practices, deliver good results. Okay, so this is also from the scientific study. And particularly in the Philippines, this is an old study, and we're PAFID, the organization that produced this, is in the process of updating it. But it hasn't changed very much. If you look at the forests, of course, there's high coincidence with key biodiversity areas, and the government has endeavored to enact legislation to protect these different areas. But what's interesting for me is that most of these areas have high coincidence with indigenous people's territories. And then there's another map that would show you where the mining applications are. And unfortunately, it's also on these areas. And so we need to work with the people. The message here is that indigenous peoples need to be part of the solution. And so we did participate quite intensively, as I said, in the process. And, the result was historic. 7 targets out of the 23 targets explicitly mention indigenous peoples. And the message here is that there is no solution to the biodiversity crisis without full engagement of indigenous peoples and, bringing their values to the fore, traditional knowledge for how to manage the biodiversity and so forth. So you have a decision that calls for full engagement with indigenous peoples in the implementation of the framework. And this is a lot of words. I'm just showing them as examples. Then you have the 30 by 30, the famous 30 by 30 target that talks about expansion of the protected area, protected estate of the world in land and in the sea to 30% from the previous 17% target. And there's quite explicit language around recognizing indigenous and traditional territories, as well as respecting the rights of indigenous peoples, including to their traditional territories. And again, you know, it's good to take a look, just zoom into how indigenous peoples exactly manage their territories. And this is a neighboring territory to my my indigenous territory. And, you know, there are very, very specific governance systems where we identify the different parts of the territory. And there are usually very, very sacred areas that cannot be touched. And, you know, it's rooted in tradition, but if you look scientifically at why that the belief is that what's the basis of the tradition, you'll see that it's quite scientific. Actually, usually they are the spawning areas of animals and so forth, and watersheds and so forth. And so, yeah, just shifting over to the work that my organization does. We work, I think this is an approach that needs to be taken, is to work with indigenous peoples and allow indigenous peoples to be able to articulate their value systems, their worldviews, their life plans. And I think that needs to be embedded in the work going forward. So it's important to put trust into the people who have lived very closely to nature and who have continued to maintain the richness of their ecosystems. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. We'll come back to you in just a few minutes. But first, we get to hear from Rod Schoonover, who's been sort of straddling this intersection of ecosystems and biodiversity and environment and its connections to stability and security for a long time, and sort of been a pioneer in that space. So Rod, can you sort of zoom back out and talk us through sort of how biodiversity connects to concepts like planetary boundaries and sort of this need to maybe think differently about security and how biodiversity fits in?
Right, and thanks to the Wilson Center and Pulitzer Center and my terrific co-panelists, who I've been quite interested in their presentations so far. Just step back. I worked for a decade in the intelligence community of the United States, where it was my job to look at environmental and ecological change as inputs to national security. And what brought me from my cushy job in California to work on government was to work on climate change. And it was pretty quickly in my tenure there, as I always try to keep abreast of scientific journals and primary science. It was pretty apparent that there was something coming out of the ecological sciences community that was fairly unknown to the security community, or at least the depth of the concern. And so it really struck me the absence, really, or maybe splotchy presence of issues of the biosphere as represented in national security policy and foreign policy. And so it, over time, and especially once I left government, I wanted to more holistically pull in the planetary effects on human, national, and global security. And so not long ago, those kinds of things were unheard of. Historically, security is focused on the military, some on political, economic dimensions, and they're undeniably important, but they don't fully encompass the full range of threats to societies and nations, and maybe they are increasingly outweighed by these planetary effects. And so it became clear to me that our traditional view of security is too narrow. So the planetary boundaries that you mentioned, like biosphere stability, freshwater use, novel entities, land system change, and climate change, they really represent limits beyond which human societies face destabilization. And so it's really incorporating this eco-security about recognizing the biophysical limits essential to security. And so, we can talk about, things like pollination. If pollination services decline just by a little bit, you would see these vast repercussions in political and social instability. But we also see from things like the previous speaker talking about the IPBES report. That's what the IPBES report is suggesting, that ecosystem services and nature's contribution to people, the very things that underpin human society, are at the risk of degrading precipitously. And so what happens when the biosphere destabilizes? Right? What does that look like? And that's one of the hard questions, because there hasn't actually been a lot of scientific work on how humanity and how societies are affected when ecosystem service degradation occurs. We know something about the economics part, because for some reason we fixate on that dimension. But there's also, what are the effects on people's food security? What are the effects on zoonotic disease? What's the effect on displacement? And so really, my partner, Sharon Burke, and I decided to put together this NGO that's focused on rejiggering national security and international security to really encompass the biosphere as a foundation, and other planetary boundaries as a foundation of stability. Over.
Okay, thank you. Well, and there's no two better people better positioned with the expertise and experience that you and Sharon Burke bring to the field. So very excited to see the launch of this NGO. I want to give a moment in case any of you want to respond to one another's comments or ask a question of each other before I go to my second round of questions, and then we can get to the Q&A questions. But given that you're all working in this space from different angles and perspectives, let me know if you'd like to chime in with any responses to the panel. Okay. I'll take the silence as we should move on. All right, great. Anton, I'm going to come back to you. One of the things that strikes me with your reporting is that it shows how illicit networks are able to navigate different gaps in policies and enforcement. In the case, you have the story about the monkeys being imported to the US from Cambodia, that being shut down, and then they're just being imported to Canada instead, right? And so sort of this lack of coherence at the international level, and well, not just the international level, but sort of multiple levels of decision making allows for these loopholes, right? And gaps, which these issues they transcend political boundaries. So if it's happening in one part of the world, it's eventually going to be happening in our part of the world, right? So could you talk a little bit about what's needed for more coherent and comprehensive responses that go beyond political borders? And from your reporting, where do you see opportunities for solutions that go beyond sort of local fixes?
Yeah, well, I guess to give a little bit of background on the story that Lauren just mentioned, Cambodia is one of the world's largest exporters of long-tailed macaques. They're a very small monkey that I actually had a picture of in that last graphic, and they're considered the world's most traded primate because we experiment on them to develop different types of vaccines. So if anyone here has been vaccinated for COVID-19, you benefited from experiments done on long-tailed macaques, most of which come from Cambodia. So we've been kind of tracking this at the Pulitzer Center and doing several stories and trying to make sure that Western audiences knew that this was happening as well, because that's where this flow of macaques was going. And naturally, we came across some things that led to corruption and wildlife trafficking, which I know Rod has done a lot of work in. So it kind of exploded and continues to be a big trade that happens. I'd say, if I had the single fix, I reckon I'd be wearing a much nicer suit. Um, I would say I was really interested at the EU Supply Chain Act. Like I really appreciated that first look at making sure that companies through every level of the process were in compliance with environmental standards. The only issue that I have with that is that we already tell companies to do that. So in my head, I was like, oh, like this has a little bit more teeth as a piece of international legislation. But we're already putting all of the burden of compliance on companies who oftentimes will benefit more from finding ways around that regulation than actually going through it. So that continues to make me a bit nervous overall. I know that's not a solution, but I think that act is a really interesting place to start. Other than that, I would say something that we need across the board is complete and utter transparency in the wildlife trade. Even in countries in Cambodia and elsewhere, and freedom to information is not a given. It's not often a right in our countries. And then the amount of effort it takes to get that information from Western countries where freedom of information is supposedly available is difficult. FOIA in the US and Canada, like it takes an exceeding amount of resources to even afford being able to do that, let alone understanding the system well enough to do. So I do think that overall we need to, either CITES or one of the regulating bodies needs to decide that this is an industry that under the table regulations or behind closed door regulations just won't fix. And we need to make that all as increasingly public as possible. And I know folks will counter me by saying, it's insider trade information, that's company information. But I think for international threats, which some of this wildlife trade can cause, that level of transparency might be needed. And I'd love to hear what, I know a lot of folks here work on wildlife trafficking, and I know that impacts all the places where you guys are focused. So curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Anton. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, well, I completely agree. Transparency, access to information is going to be very important, as well as going beyond just voluntary voluntary frameworks for disclosure of information, disclosure of impact, dependencies of companies on nature, and so forth. I think we need to go towards regulation. Because one of the things that came out during the negotiations for the new framework is that there are actually a lot of incentives being given to companies that are causing damage to biodiversity. And so because there was a severe lack of financing for conservation and for biodiversity protection, the thought was that why don't we transform these incentives that are negative incentives for biodiversity into positive incentives? And I think the framework fell a little bit short of going towards regulation, although it's heartening to see that a number of countries are actually putting regulations in place to make sure that that they are able to require companies to disclose, and they are able to track better some of these, whether, for example, exports of beef to the US or to Canada are the result of deforesting, the Amazon rainforest or the Indonesian rainforest. And so I think that's an important step, and I think we need to have more of those.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Okay. Joao, I think, this point about the need for transparent information also ties into the need for real research on the ground, like that of what you're doing in the Amazon, and really understanding what these connections look like on the ground and the consequences of acting or not acting, right? So I wonder if you could share from your perspective the sort of the importance of the research, the impact that it has. What are some of the barriers to doing that research, right? And opportunities from the international community or national governments or the private sector, philanthropy, to really support research that then is able to inform better policies and investments.
Yeah, I think that almost everything is about like a war of narratives. And for a long time, we got this narrative that people was part of the problem, that the Amazon, I'm talking more specifically in Amazonia, but I think that this discussion is very aligned with most condition of traditional people around tropical countries, because those people were always neglected and excluded from the conservation perspective. I think that once science more with more inclusiveness and more aligned with the front line can help us with the narrative showing the opposite direction, that actually conservation is made by people and for people. I think for a long time, conservation was something at the end, like a project output, a project outcome. And in fact, what we see is that conservation is a way of life. It's a way that people can improve their quality of life, can keep their worldviews, their spiritual value, and all these things are important in tropical environment. And I think that science can help us to strengthen those narratives to impact public policies, because those traditional people are with the heavy burden of conservation. They are protecting their territory almost without support. For example, as I said, in Amazonia, we have a huge environmental service conducted by local people, and they are not rewarded for that. Biodiversity-based value chains within the major bioeconomy approach that is arriving with a very strong force in Amazonia are very interesting, but the market do not pay enough to really consolidate the dignity of the people that are protecting the forest. Actually, all biodiversity-based value chains that we have in Amazonia do not cover the production cost of traditional people. So I think that is very imperative to think in wider programs of payment for environmental service to reward and recognize those strong efforts that local population are doing in terms of conservation. I think that this is very, very important, and I think science can help to strengthen those narratives, but always recognizing the role of local people. They are the protagonists, and scientists and conservationists are like an alliance. They can help to amplify the local voices, but we need to recognize the protagonism of local people that are doing conservation for a long time. Sometimes people ask it, but how to engage local people in conservation projects? And I think we need to deeply change this question to how can we engage in conservation practices that local people are doing for millennia. We need to change this protagonism point of view, I think, to help to consolidate this narrative and strengthen the territories.
That's great. Thank you, Joel. It's a really good point. And you bring up the important point of financing. I moderated a panel that was hosted by the Colombian Embassy at with SAIS yesterday, focused on advancing financing for biodiversity conservation. And I think it was recorded. So for anybody watching this, for a deeper conversation on financing, I would encourage you to find that event, because it had a really fantastic panel, including the director of the Global Environment Facility, Carlos Rodriguez, who was the sort of payment for ecosystem services was his brainchild, I think. But it underscored to me how complicated the financing piece is, and how sort of the diversity of sort of the need for a diverse portfolio of financing opportunities, and having it tied to sort of the paradigm shift of how we think about biodiversity conservation. So I would pose this question to the panel in terms of, and it's okay if you don't want to weigh in on it because it's not everybody's cup of tea. The financing piece is a complicated piece, but how can, where do you see opportunities for the global community to scale up financing for biodiversity conservation? Because there is a very significant gap in terms of how we're deploying financing and investments for biodiversity conservation. Anton, can I start with you? Because I think that you might have, no? Yes. Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, as a reporter, I would say climate finance is the sector that I'm trying to understand better, because I think it is quite difficult to wrap my head around. I guess I'll just start with one of my leading concerns. In all the conversations about climate finance, some of the regions and countries that would be meant to receive the largest amount of the pot often struggle the most with corruption. And that's like a really tender topic to get into. And that terrifies me because I not only think that the amount of money going into climate finance will not at all mitigate the negative impacts of the typhoons that wall up the Philippines every year and the droughts hitting the Mekong. I just don't think it's at scale. And the small pot that we do have, I'm a little concerned about what would eventually make it to the ground. And that's something that I haven't seen anybody really like address or speak to me about. And everyone's just chatting about different ways that countries and governments can access this magical pot of climate finance, and what eventually would make it down to the groups that half of these panelists are actually working with terrify me. And I think the carbon credit programs in Cambodia and a couple of other countries are really good examples of that, about like how much money is supposedly coming in and what eventually reaches forest communities. And I would say that's one of the things in climate finance that as a reporter, I haven't figured out a way to cover that yet because it's a very, theoretical issue that could happen in the future once this climate finance gets distributed, supposedly.
Thanks, Anton. Rod.
At the risk of calling this our situation complete insanity, in terms of what the costs of preventing what is looking like an ecologically embedded polycrisis with human, national, and global security overtones. And there is a clear security argument for increasing financing for nature and climate. And I think one of the difficulties is trying to get people to see this. I think sometimes when we talk about it as an environmental issue, for some reason over the last 20, 30 years, that has gotten us to think of it as someone else's job. So that's someone else doing that. We have the Minister of Environment. And so I, as the National Security Advisor or the head of state, I don't have to think about these things in the same way. And that I hope people realize, I hope the message is getting through, that stability is not possible without ecological stability. And so that's what we're toying with here. And so, and just, by looking at everything through a financial lens, leads to real danger. And I think bringing the security argument in, where the return on investment is a different story. We don't worry about how much X, Y, and Z costs if it secures people and nations and the international system. Over.
So let me ask you a follow-up. Because, under the Biden administration, there has been a concerted effort to better integrate climate considerations across the US government and its portfolio, right? But I think it's also become clear about how complicated it is to rewire these very complex, systems to meaningfully integrate these considerations and not make it another checkbox or a a single position that gets sort of buried under a big portfolio. So do you have, this is maybe an unfair question, but like, how can we do better?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. I know it's a question that you struggle with yourself. It's for me, how do you get people and institutions who deliver the correct and the meaningful rhetoric? How do you now change that into things that appear in an org chart or in a budget? Right? Because that's where meaningful change happens. And I think really back to this polycrisis idea of, when you bring climate change and ecological networks, which are highly adaptive, highly complex systems, when you start to see them degrade, you have the recipe for, as I said, an ecologically embedded polycrisis. And one of the lessons you learn from studying this is to stay far away from that. And so what that means, you work on the front end. You don't put into place the conditions to go towards that. And that, for me, what that means is putting national security professionals or thought leaders or even rising people in the security world. You put them in that situation of where of a potential future, and so that they can see, you can backcast and see what should we have done 10 years ago to have avoided all of this. And just one last piece, you brought up this really interesting scientific study earlier about the connection between bats and infant mortality. There's a number of those, like vultures dying in India and causing a public health crisis. But we know so little about that. And so I think building the scientific basis for the nature security nexus is something that the security community should not just advocate for, I think they should resource it.
Thanks, Rod. Jennifer, can I come back to you on the point about financing, but as it connects to the foregrounding of Indigenous knowledge and leadership in this space?
Yeah, well, the main demand now from Indigenous peoples, and I'm really grateful to Anton and to Joao, who have actually laid the foundations of the argument about the people who are on the ground actually needing to be the ones receiving the finance. And so the Indigenous movement now is pushing for direct access to finance by Indigenous peoples. At COP15, this was already raised, right? Because there were studies showing that that it was domestic funding largely that was financing biodiversity action, and that the promise of funding from developed countries going to developing countries was negligible. They weren't fulfilling their promises. And for Indigenous peoples, it's even worse, because the trickle down, when you have to wait for all of these financing to trickle down to the communities where the action is actually taking place, you wait a long time, and by the time it gets to you, it's a very, very small amount. And so we were happy when they established the GBF fund, basically, that was within the Global Environment Facility. And then there was a commitment for 20% of that fund to go to Indigenous peoples, only for us to realize later that it was funding that goes to governments, and that they would account throughout their program how much went to Indigenous people. So it's still money that's held by the government. And it's tricky, because in Southeast Asia, or in Asia more broadly, and in Africa, Indigenous peoples are not even recognized as entities, as distinct entities. And so, it's really important to find new ways to get the money to the ground where the conservation action, biodiversity protection action is actually taking place. And then, going a step further, we, beyond financing, is actually the tapping into the technical expertise of indigenous people. So we have a target that talks about traditional knowledge needing to be part of, needing to inform biodiversity decision making. But then you have, situations where academics are coming into indigenous communities and documenting traditional knowledge and verifying using a Western lens whether this traditional knowledge is valid. And, there's a lot that needs to be changed. We start with financing because this way, in that way, indigenous peoples would be able, and local communities would be able to, implement their vision of what a good life for all looks like. And yeah, so yeah, and maybe the last thing I want to say, and I'm a little bit hesitant to say this, the Global Witness report came out a few days ago. And this is the entity that tracks the number of environmental and human rights defenders killed. And as usual, we see again, true to the trends in the past years, a huge percentage are indigenous peoples and those who are defending their traditional lands. And so, we need to take a look at that as well. What steps do we need to take? Finance is one part of the answer, because one of the things that we've done as Niatero, as an organization, is to fund entities that protect human rights defenders at risk. And, it takes resources to protect these people. For them, the Minister of Environment of Brazil, for example, used to be an activist, and there were really very, very bad threats to her life, and we had to provide legal and sanctuary funds for her to continue to protect, carry out her protection actions. So yeah, we need direct finance is the summary of that long-winded explanation. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you, Jennifer. It's a really important point about environmental defenders and the fact that so many of them are from indigenous communities. Joao, did you want to chime in? Yes, please.
Yes, no, I just would like to say that I really fully agree with Jennifer. And just to complement, I think that to really bring this funding to the front line, it's very important to try to ensure that local people participate on decision-making structures. So everywhere in our organization, even in small organization, we need to bring local people to participate, truly participate of decision-making, large organizations, governmental spheres, because only in this way we will be bringing these local voices and fighting for spaces and ensure that this flow of funding can really impact the front line.
Thanks, Joelle. I'm going to weave in some of the questions that are coming in from online, and another reminder to those watching online to please input your questions into the box below the video. We want to hear from you. There's a question from Peter Adolfo Asante, who is in Ghana and working as a journalist and interested in sort of exposing some of the illegal mining and its impacts in Ghana. And so he asks, what steps can journalists take to help fight against practices that endanger biodiversity and are becoming more widespread? And I'm paraphrasing here. These are not his exact words. And one note, Peter, I would encourage you to send us a note, the ECSP, because we're the illegal mining and sort of mining more broadly is an issue that we are looking at and are working to engage with journalists, because the storytelling component of this is very important, and being able to understand better what's going on the ground in different places is important to informing better policies. And so, Anton, I would turn to you as our resident journalist here to I mean, I think it's a challenge, right? We had an event on with the Society for Environmental Journalists last spring, focused on environmental journalism and how critical it is, also for sort of the strengthening democracy, right? Like that you need to be able to have transparency and on the ground reporting that really tells a story of what is happening. But it's severely underfunded. And going back to Jennifer's point about sort of the danger of environmental defenders, environmental journalists have come under threat as well, right? So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I guess to please my editors, Peter, I would also encourage you to send an email to the Pulitzer Center. We operate in the Amazon basin. I'm sorry, in the Congo basin. So we have rainforest investigative fellows covering a lot of issues like mining in Cameroon, Uganda, the Congo, and a couple of other places in the Congo basin. So if that was something you're interested, I guarantee you will need funding to cover that story. I just got back from a big trip to present a gold mining investigation that we did in Cambodia, and we needed quite a lot of funding to do that story correctly, to speak to people on the ground, to speak to experts. So I'd say, unfortunately, the number one thing that you're going to need for any environmental investigation in a somewhat struggling industry, I think it's fair to say, in a financially unstable industry like journalism, is funding. And very, very few newsrooms, if not none of the newsrooms that I work with, would be able to afford it themselves. I've been freelancing for 8 months. I work for 8 outlets. None of them would be able to spend the amount of money that we spent on the gold mining investigation in Cambodia. So in terms of like tangibly, what would it take for you to sell a story that would then be able to be read by people? You'd need to hit funding and grantors as quickly as possible. In terms of convincing them to fund the story, the number one trick for every environmental investigation that I've done is the supply chain. Unfortunately, and I'll be completely frank, people did not care that there was gold mining in Cambodia. It was quite difficult to sell that story even to a regional outlet. Everyone was like, oh, well, you know, there's gold mining everywhere. But where is that gold going? Who's buying it and how much are they buying? And that would immediately, unfortunately, kind of as Ron was speaking about, we do view things greatly on a financial lens. But that's usually what engages editors very quickly. And then, of course, that's when you loop in. And this massive trade is impacting these people on the ground and is doing this to biodiversity and then is doing this. So kind of what hooks people is the amount of cash in a given extractives industry like mining. And then that's how you use that hook to tell the rest of the story. So yeah, I'd say number one, funding, because no outlet on its normal budget would be able to cover that. And then number two, you'll have to pick the type of mining that you can track as best as you can. What product is it that they're mining out, and how can you track that to wherever it's going? Because I guarantee you it's most often not being used in Ghana. We're not mining $200 million worth of gold in Cambodia for Cambodian use. So I would say that supply chain is really key. And then I'm happy to chat later. There are a bunch of resources that track different types of mining online that groups like the Harvard Growth Lab and a couple of others are using. So there are a lot of tools now a day that kind of track supply chain. So happy to chat further about that, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, Anton, that's a good point. Peter should definitely get in touch with the Pulitzer Center. They support a lot of really fantastic and important reporting. And I think one of the things that's so important about this is because these issues are so large and because they're so context specific as well, right? Like being able to have those on the ground reporting and investigative stories is so important for telling the bigger story that we're trying to tell. Rod, over to you.
Yeah. Well, I'm just surprised that journalists don't more often make the rule of law argument as something that is a core component of state stability. I mean, in addition to environmental degradation and human rights and environmental defenders, these people are on the front lines of stabilizing the ecosystems on which humanity really relies. And so, just the erosion of public trust in governments from things like undermining the rule of law. I'm surprised we don't see that more in stories rather than just environmental degradation.
Thanks, Rod. Okay, here's a question from Catherine Bauman, related to eco-security. Do you think that there are any current interventions that have been effective in bringing eco-stability in certain impacted areas? And what is the path to improve this process? So does anybody have, I mean, Joao, you had a great example, I think, with the sort of protection of the, arapaina fish and the community's role in that. What kinds of interventions? I think thinking across the sort of scales, right? From the local to the sort of state to regional to international. Anton, you also mentioned the EU supply chain regulations. So do you all have different other examples of effective interventions?
I think that community-based protection of environment is very efficient, but when you include in the arrangement like more powerful actors, like illegal gold miners in Brazil, or people that have too much resource and money, like loggers, illegal loggers, then we have a very unequal condition for local communities, and they cannot handle this type of issue. It's not like fair. So we need more intervention from the government, and then we have a huge lack of support because many local leaders are endangered in Brazil, are threatened by those powerful actors, and the government do not have enough support to ensure the security of those people. So we need to be careful with this discussion because there is a trade-off. Of course, community-based arrangement can be like a good strategy to avoid overexploitation of natural resources, but at the same time, they not be alone carrying on the hard building of territorial protection. So we need some very strong support from the government, which is lacking at this moment.
Thanks, Joao. So it's one tool in a toolbox of many, right? The sort of community-based engagement. I think the Colombian government has in their discussions of the COP16 and their framing of it have connected the issue of biodiversity to peace, right? And Colombia, of course, with its history and the peace agreement and how they are thinking about sort of environmental considerations alongside peace building and supporting communities brings a different maybe lens to this discussion than has previously been present at these biodiversity COPs. Jennifer, I want to go to you and going back to that point about direct support to indigenous communities, but not in a vacuum, right? Recognizing this is one intervention among many, and what might those other sort of supporting interventions look like?
Yeah, COP16 is looming, and it's great that the theme of the overall theme of COP16 is peace with nature, and so there's a lot of space to we indigenous peoples resonate quite strongly with that theme. We've had a couple of meetings with the Minister of Environment from Colombia and among indigenous peoples worldwide to talk about what our priorities would be, because COP16 is the COP where they follow up on implementation, right? They have to look at the status of revision of the national biodiversity strategies. And what we are looking at in particular is how indigenous peoples have been engaged and have been part of that process. And then, it's easy just to invite indigenous peoples to the process, but if they have absolutely no idea, they have absolutely no preparation to engage in the process, then it wouldn't be so effective. So I think there's a role for organizations that have biodiversity and conservation as expertise to help out, and for the funding entities to also provide support for Indigenous peoples to be able to acquire the expertise necessary to be able to engage, right? To speak the same language, the language that the biodiversity community could understand. Because although we know what we do within our territory, the way that we express it, which is in spiritual terms, doesn't necessarily translate into how the bureaucrats talk about it, the conservation community talk about it. And so based on our experience here in the Philippines, we had the privilege to be supported to convene those spaces. And as a result, we had this Indigenous Peoples Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. And I think, and we submitted it to the government, and they've committed to include it as part of their national biodiversity strategy. And this is something that we hope could be replicated everywhere, because it's really important for there to be a convergence among the funders, the government representatives, the conservation community, and Indigenous peoples in order to make sure that we implement the commitments in relation to biodiversity in the most effective way and most efficient way possible. So it's important for people to come together. And then, of course, we have some agenda items, just some technical things on the table. There is a proposal for a subsidiary body on Indigenous peoples to be created, and a new work program on Indigenous peoples and local communities to be adopted at COP16. And luckily, the ministry has agreed to support that. But there needs to be a global platform where these collaborations can take place between government, conservation community, funders, and Indigenous peoples and local communities. So we're going to push really hard for that, and we hope that it can be adopted at COP16.
Thank you, Jennifer. A question from Megan Parker, who's the incoming Executive Director of the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing and former Executive Director of the Society of Environmental Journalists, and a former member of our team here at the Wilson Center. Going back to Rod's point about the role of environmental journalism and the rule of law. So for you, Rod and Anton, how can we help environmental journalists make that link? Rod, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I was going to let Anton go first, but so rule of law is really about social stability, right? And so ways that manifest as threats to the rule of law are all through this discussion, right? It's corruption that's aided by by the supposed and real financial gains that come from things like wildlife trafficking. But it's also buttressed by things like arguments that when the rule of law breaks down, it's not just the environment that gets affected. It's human rights. It's also GDP gets affected, right? So there's a literature that connects corruption and threats to the rule of law to political instability, right? Because when the government doesn't work and people are angry about it, right, and sometimes that contributes to social and political instability, one of the big reasons is because the government or whatever entity you're looking at is not always acting on the best interests of the citizens. And so this is what the rule of law argument, I think, can get at. Whose security are we talking about? Who are we, as the, who are the people in power working towards? These are dangerous stories, of course, in this environment. We should be quite clear. But I think, just in the term environmental defenders, well, they're defending a lot more than just the environment.
Thanks, Rod. Anton?
I actually got goosebumps. Megan and I have been following each other on Twitter for like 4 years. So it's nice to officially kind of sort of meet you, Megan. Yeah, I guess I'll give really tangible advice on, I guess, 3 scales. For the public, for the people who are consuming this media on the call, I would say the biggest thing that helps environmental investigation is eyeballs. I'm never going to ask somebody to subscribe to news because I think there's a wealth gap, and I don't think that's fair. So if you can't subscribe to news, I would encourage you to try to find, access available stories and share those. Because the way that I get countered when I pitch stories is, well, your last one didn't do well. So why would I do that again? So that's like a big thing. So if it indeed is important, and people on this call on a Friday morning or Friday evening where Jen and I are, if you do seem to care, please share those stories, because the page views, the amount of time on articles read, the amount of shares, those likes, that's what gets other stories assigned. So for the public side, I would say most people are on social media. That's something that you can immediately do. For groups like the Society of Environmental Journalism, for the Wilson Center, for the Pulitzer Center, I think a big thing that we need, I know nobody wants to hear it, but we need a lot more security trainings. I think like a lot of the folks that I work with at the Rainforest Investigations Network, we've had really specialized training on how to do this and do this safely. And I'd say a lot of folks are not, and then getting themselves hurt or getting themselves in trouble with governments, and doing it in not the safest way through no fault of their own, through the fact that there isn't a lot of help for this type of specialized training, because there aren't a lot of environmental journalists globally. So I'd say something that, and of course funding for these projects could be helpful. For folks like Rod and other experts and policymakers in the field, for NGOs, it might be controversial to say we could really use some whistleblowing help. Especially when we're looking at rule of law stuff. It takes journalists, it's exceedingly difficult. There's things and things you can publish. So even if I'm 99% certain that the rule of law is being broken by these characters, if I do not have a paper trail, my editor is going to nix that, or the lawyer is going to nix that. So I think a lot of folks kind of think that we're just going to find a bunch of this stuff, but it's really hard and really expensive to do. So if there's anybody that's sitting on a treasure trove of documents or information, please, I encourage you to engage with the press. We are in a bit of a struggling industry. So we need as much assistance as we can get on that side. And those paper trails, that's what makes an investigation. We don't point fingers. We can't say that we think that maybe that person is benefiting. We need the paper trails, and even the pushes in the right directions. So I'd really encourage folks to email us, to engage with us as much as you can if there are things happening in your industries, in your companies, in your governments that you think the public needs to know.
Thanks, Anton. And I would also encourage journalists to reach out to people like Rod and the other panelists here, but Rod and Sharon Burke with the Eco-Security Council, this is a connection that they've been making for a long time, right? And so being able to put some of these context-specific issues into the broader sort of rule of law context and governance is something that there are a number of experts who have been working in this space, and as well as here at ECSP. Let's see, we're about 10 minutes out. So I'm gonna bring one more question from the audience, and then I want to wrap up. I'm gonna give you all a minute to think about this as well. But in terms of COP16, what would a successful COP16 look like? And so for your closing remarks, just a couple of quick thoughts on what success looks like in the context of COP16. But first, a question from Jack Denton, who is director of TMP, which is a consulting group working on climate, environment, and social links. What have been some of the most effective messages for engaging with the actors who are driving habitat loss? And I think there's an example of sort of agriculture, right? Land use change. I mean, there are trade-offs, tricky trade-offs, not just economic ones, but also need-based ones. So what have been the most effective messages, or I guess interventions, in terms of protecting specific local forms of biodiversity that feed into this sort of broader focus on biodiversity at the international level? Joao, you're doing a lot of this work. So talk to us about what messages have been most effective in your work.
Well, I think we try to focus our message in terms of social justice and social rights of traditional people, because I think it's very imperative to reframe some historical problems and inequalities that we have been experiencing here in Amazonia. But I think that in terms of message for the drivers, actors of deforestation, and I think that now we are observing that what can help in a context of increasing of fires, increasing of extreme events, changes on the water cycle dynamics. Everything is connected with the production of those actors, and they will feel very, very negative impacts very soon, because everything is changing. For example, in Brazil, we are living terrible days in terms of pollution in large cities and changing, in the climate conditions. So I think that it started to affect the production of soybeans, of other commodities, and they will need to handle the environmental problem. There is no other pathway,
Jennifer, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the messages that you have? I mean, I feel like you've been a really important interlocutor, right, between communities and the sort of threats that biodiversity in those communities are facing. And what kinds of messages have resonated most?
I think, yeah, Joao has covered a lot of what I wanted to say. But when the threat is felt immediately, that's when the people are spurred to action. So, for example, in the Philippines, when in a place in Mindanao, there was a really bad typhoon, and there was the floods were terrible, the landslides were terrible. But for some reason, there was this one community that didn't experience so much flooding and landslides, and they realized that because upstream there were indigenous peoples who were managing the flow of water quite carefully. And so, I think making the connections between the immediate effects that were being felt in the form of disasters by people, and just pointing out, making the connections to what went wrong here and what went right in this space, that made them understand quite quickly, because they felt the effects right away. And as a result of that, there were payment for ecosystem services that were arranged with the community in the upstream area. And because of the resources that they had, they were able to resist encroachments by militias, armed militia. And that's the hope as well with COP16, is that when you're able to make the connection between what deforestation is doing to our environment, and make the connection if there's a drought in the community, and so yeah, I think it's a matter of just making the connections, so that whatever things that people are experiencing acutely at the moment could be traced to actions that they have undertaken maybe in the past, or still undertaking, then that could spur change. Wildfires is also one example. We have a partner in Australia that has made a really convincing argument around the cultural burning that they've been doing for 10,000 years. Right. And that's the reason why their area hasn't experienced any wildfires. And now they're exporting the knowledge to Canada, to other places. But I think, just looking at the traditional knowledge around these things, and then presenting it as a solution to felt, effects at the moment, that has been quite effective.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think one thing that I would add, based on the panel from yesterday was it's having the narrative, but it's also providing those actors with the tools to make different decisions, right? And so there was a woman who in the audience who was with a company that was supporting smallholder farmers because they didn't have enough land to sort of benefit from some of the payment for ecosystem services opportunities on their own, right? But if and also just the technological capability to make those connections and find those sort of pathways for investments that allow them to not use the land for other purposes. And so also just thinking about that individual level, and it's not always just a narrative that's going to work, right? They need the tools themselves to be part of this sort of global effort around biodiversity conservation. And so what that looks like in different places is going to change, but having support for individuals on the ground who have ownership of some of this land is going to be important as well. Okay, I think we're at our final minute, so I'm going to go around and invite you to share any final thoughts and what you hope to see out of COP16, given your perspective. And I think I will start with Joao.
Okay. No, I think that in terms of take-home message, I only would like to reinforce what we discussed. There is no other possibility to ensure the conservation of tropical environments without local people in leadership condition. I think this is the most strong evidence that we have been highlighting in the last decade. So they are doing the hard work and the more efficient work to protect the environment, the tropical environments. So basically, if the world would like to protect those environments, we need to find clear and effective mechanisms to reward those efforts, making the support arrive at the front line. I think that this is the challenge that we have and one of the biggest priority.
Thank you, Joao. Anton?
I'll keep my journalism hat on just so I don't repeat anything that any of the others would speak about. I would consider COP16 somewhat of a success if I saw coverage that was accessible and understandable and digestible from every Southeast Asian nation. Will I see a story about COP16's impact on Brunei's oil industry or on COP16's impact on the loss and damages funds access for the Philippines or waste management issues in Thailand or Cambodia? Will I see stories on those that are accessible to people in native languages and are written in a way that are understandable? I would consider that a success because I haven't seen that out of any other COP that I've seen from a distance because I haven't been able to cover one. So I would consider that a huge success if we made that information available in the countries that are supposedly meant to be benefiting from those conversations.
That's a great point. They did say, I think there's like 700 journalists signed up to attend COP. So you would think that there are lots of opportunities there for some really relevant and grounded stories. Rod, over to you.
Yeah, so a successful COP from a security perspective would mean things like enabling mechanisms to ensure nations meet their targets, because that reduces ecological risks that can lead to instability. It would mean streamlining funding to vulnerable people to enhance resilience, reducing the risk of resource conflicts. And basically comes back to this notion that I find myself talking about a lot in public fora, is that security is fundamentally a good idea and a good word, despite its connotations over the years, which hasn't always been great. But security can't be sustainable if it remains a top-down endeavor. And so, it leads to who gets to decide what constitutes security, whose security are we talking about? And these are fundamental questions that I think we as people have to address as we are trying to correctly align security policy and doctrine for the decades ahead.
Thank you, Rod. And Jennifer, you can close us out.
Thank the top line message is similar to Joao. In fact, probably exactly the same. There is no pathway towards addressing the biodiversity crisis without Indigenous peoples and local communities. And in order to get there, there has to be full, effective, equitable participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the planning, implementation, and monitoring of the targets and the goals that we have set for ourselves as a global community. This can be achieved if there is a high-level platform that enables those partnerships. There is a commitment to direct funding, and there is a strong monitoring framework, because the reality is countries will not implement what they're not required to monitor. So things like security of tenure of Indigenous peoples over their lands and waters need to be in the monitoring framework. Status and trends of traditional occupations, because those are what enabled Indigenous peoples to preserve their lands so well. And participation and traditional knowledge need to be part of this monitoring framework so that the countries are more conscious about implementing it. So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I want to thank all of you for being with us this morning, this evening, Friday night. For some of you, it was a really fantastic panel. You're all doing such important work, and it's a privilege to be able to feature you at this event. I want to thank our partners at the Pulitzer Center, and I want to thank them and Nat Geo Society for the really important work that you're supporting on the ground around the world. And I want to thank our AV team for letting us do this morning. And then, of course, the ECSP team, Claire Doyle and Angus Soderberg, for their support. Thank you all very much. I think we'll come back to you perhaps after the COP and get a little bit of a debrief and see what next steps there are. So thank you very much. And thank you for those tuning in. Goodbye.